Welcome to the debate. So usually when we picture society, we think of it as a machine. You put the gears in place, you lubricate them with laws, and if you stop cranking the handle, the whole thing just flies apart.
Right. The assumption is that order requires this continuous external force.
Exactly. But, what if cooperation isn't this heavy ball being pushed up a hill, but actually one naturally rolling to the bottom of a valley?
Like an attractor state?
Yeah, so today we are exploring that exact question. Is human cooperation a self-sustaining, natural default, or is it a fragile state that requires structural enforcement?
And we are grounding this discussion in the work of philosopher Boris Kriger, specifically his book, Cooperation as a Law of Nature. And, well, I argue that while his ideas are fascinating, complex human systems inevitably need defined protocols to survive severe disruptions.
And I'll be arguing that cooperation is our biological baseline. It actually thrives the most when we just stop interfering with it.
Okay, so how does Kiger actually prove this baseline?
Well, he argues mutual aid isn't some precarious moral achievement, right? He actually ran a shelter in the Muskoka forest for 9 years with virtually zero rules.
Wow, 9 years.
Yeah, 9 years. He literally left the door open, and it worked. And not by magic, but through biological feedback loops. Like when we help someone, our brains release oxytocin and dopamine.
Right, the chemical reward.
Exactly. That localized chemical reward reinforces the behavior organically. So if you remove institutional coercion, people just self-organize because our biology drives us toward it.
The shelter is an incredible case study, sure, but being isolated in a deep forest acts as its own passive filter.
How so?
Well, it is a geographic anomaly. You do not get random walk-ins the way you do in a city. Beyond that, Kriger acknowledges they did have one operational boundary, which was no physical violence.
Sure, a basic safety baseline.
Right. But when violent actors crossed that line, the community used temporary separation. They kicked them out. That boundary, no matter how minimal, is a governance rule. It is structural enforcement protecting the system.
But does that minimal boundary negate the whole premise? Look at scale-free networks like Wikipedia or open-source software.
Oh, the digital examples.
Yeah! They coordinate millions of people without centralized command. Kriger says it functions similarly to James Watt's centrifugal governor in early steam engines.
You will have to break that down for us.
Sure. So, in an engine, if it spins too fast, these metal weights naturally rise up due to centrifugal force.
Okay.
And that mechanically chokes off the steam valve, slowing the engine back down completely organically.
Interesting.
Right? The system regulates itself through local feedback. There is no external operator needed. Kriger observed that the real disruptions in his shelter, the things that broke the local feedback loop, came from socially functional individuals who arrived trying to impose hierarchies.
Wait, so the rule makers were the problem?
Yes. The rule makers were the perturbation.
Well, that engine metaphor works perfectly for mild fluctuations. But what happens when the pressure spikes so fast the boiler just explodes?
What do you mean?
Self-regulation only works until the system completely overloads, which is exactly what happened in the shelter with the man with the cleaver incident.
Ah, yes, the cleaver incident.
Yeah, a resident suffered a severe psychotic break, armed himself, and demanded to be killed. The community's primary self-regulating tool was, strategic ignoring, and that failed completely.
It did fail in that acute moment, yes.
They had to call the police and emergency medical services. Doesn't relying on external, state-funded force during an acute crisis prove that pure self-organization has a hard limit?
Well, it proves every system has a breaking point, sure. But the true measure of resilience isn't avoiding every single crisis. It is the mechanism of recovery.
Okay, but they still outsource the recovery.
Only for the acute danger. After the police took the man away, how did the shelter react? In a traditional institution, an event like that triggers endless policy reviews, security cameras, collective punishment.
That is true. The bureaucracy usually takes over.
Exactly. But Kriger's community absorbed the shock and returned to their cooperative equilibrium the very next day, without generating a single new rule.
Because they outsourced the structural enforcement to the state. They didn't need to make a new rule because the police handled the threat for them.
They let the acute crisis be handled by emergency services, sure, but they refuse to let that crisis permanently alter their daily operational state.
Which is a luxury of having those services available.
Maybe, but Kriger argues that reactionary, permanent bureaucratic rules are the exact forces that convert cooperative communities into antagonistic ones. They kept the environment conducive to mutual aid.
And I still maintain that without baseline structures, like knowing you can just call the police, a system cannot survive its worst nights.
You think the safety net is mandatory?
Absolutely. When extreme disruptions hit, you need defined boundaries to prevent permanent fractures in the community. Emerging cooperation is powerful, but it needs that safety net.
Whereas I take away that institutional perturbation is the primary obstacle to our natural cooperative state. We don't need to force people to work together. We just need to stop breaking their biological capacity to do so.
It really forces a hard look at the mechanics of the systems we build every day, doesn't it?
It does. Think back to that ball resting comfortably at the bottom of the valley and the artificial fan blowing it halfway up the hillside.
Right.
In our own communities, we have to ask ourselves, are we building environments that let human nature settle into its cooperative resting place, or are we the ones plugging in the fan?
So if you put 10 strangers in a house with absolutely no rules, you'd probably expect a complete reality TV disaster, right? Like just pure chaos.
Oh, totally. We are so conditioned to believe that strict rules and, massive bureaucracies are the only things keeping society from just completely collapsing.
Right. But today we're doing a deep dive into Boris Kriger's manuscript, Cooperation as a Law of Nature. And our mission is to really explore this radical, scientifically backed idea that human cooperation isn't something we have to force.
Yeah, Kriger argues it's actually our biological and mathematical default, as long as the system just gets out of the way.
And he uses this brilliant analogy for it. He says, imagine dropping a ball into a valley, so naturally it just rolls down to the bottom.
Right, and in this scenario, the bottom of the valley is cooperation. That's the resting state.
Exactly. But then somebody comes along and installs this massive fan halfway down the slope.
And that fan represents, institutional rules, top-down management, basically all the bureaucracy we impose on ourselves, so it blows the ball sideways.
So we're watching the ball struggling on the hill.
Yeah.
And we think, oh man, it takes immense energy to keep society functioning.
When really, if we just turned off the fan, the ball would roll to the bottom on its own.
And the craziest part is Kriger actually tested this. He didn't just write a theory. For 9 years, he ran a shelter in the Muskoka forest with absolutely no rules.
Zero rules, no intake forms, no chore charts, nothing. And he took in highly marginalized people, folks battling severe mental illness, addiction.
And without any forced structure, they organically maintained a functioning home. It really makes you rethink things. So it's like we've been trying to force a machine to work by manually spinning its gears when it was actually a self-winding watch all along.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the mainspring of that watch is our neurochemistry.
Okay, biology, right.
Yeah, because when you help someone, your brain releases oxytocin and dopamine. It creates this self-reinforcing biological loop. You help, you get a chemical reward, and so you want to help more.
You don't need a rule book for that.
Exactly. You don't need rules to mandate behavior your biology already actively encourages.
Okay, but I'm going to push back a little here because a dopamine hit from doing the dishes or, I don't know, sharing groceries is one thing. What happens when a real crisis hits?
Like a real emergency.
Yeah. A self-winding watch still shatters if you hit it with a hammer. Without rules, doesn't it just descend into panic?
Well, the shelter actually faced the ultimate stress test for this. At 2 a.m. one night, one of the residents had a severe psychotic break. He was out on the porch wielding a meat cleaver.
Wait, a meat cleaver? Are you serious?
Yeah, claiming he had superpowers. Highly dangerous situation.
That is terrifying. That's the exact moment you'd think a rule-free system would completely fail.
But the community did exactly what you do in a medical crisis. They called an ambulance.
Okay, that makes sense.
But of course, the ambulance brought the police. And the police incorrectly assumed it was a hostage situation, so they deployed undercover officers in the yard and turned a mental health crisis into a tactical standoff. Oh, wow. So they blew a massive fan at the ball.
Exactly. They added massive institutional perturbation to a situation that just needed de-escalation. The police actually escalated the crisis.
That is so frustrating. What happened to the guy?
Well, he did eventually receive compulsory treatment, but unfortunately the system released him just 2 weeks later.
Wait, 2 weeks? And where did he go?
Right back to the shelter. He came back and literally just waited around until his court date, which was almost a year later.
A whole year.
Yeah, only after that year was he finally admitted to a permanent mental health facility.
That is wild. But wait, how did the shelter handle him coming back, or even just the morning after the initial standoff?
The very next morning, they were eating breakfast together. The community completely absorbed the shock. They bounced right back to their cooperative equilibrium.
Because the underlying network of trust was still intact?
Precisely. Connection over control.
Which makes me wonder, if a group of vulnerable people can self-regulate during a crisis like that, can this scale, like beyond a rural shelter? It already does. Think about Wikipedia or open source software like Linux. These are what we call scale-free networks.
Right, so no bosses, no central servers, just decentralized connection.
Exactly. Information flows laterally, not top-down. If a highly connected person sees a problem, they fix it by example, and everyone adapts instantly. Decentralized connection achieves order way faster than centralized control.
It really makes you realize that our institutions often break the very cooperation they're supposedly trying to protect.
We install the fan, and then we complain that the ball won't roll.
Wow. Well, that leaves you with a pretty radical thought to mull over today. Look at the relationships and structures in your own life. If you abruptly turned off the fans of forced management tomorrow, what natural cooperation might finally be allowed to roll into place?